So we've heard about a couple new chips that are coming out that are a little bit curious. First of all, Intel has their Z490 chipset and AMD has their Z490 chipset. But the Z390 is very nearly identical to the Z370, and we just have no idea what the hell the Z490 is for. I mean, last generation AMD had the X499 for Threadripper and up to the X370 for Ryzen. So why do they need an intermediary high-end? It just doesn't make sense. I have a theory for that. Hear me out. It's gonna sound crazy, but if I were AMD, it's what I would do. So I want to preface this by I have no insider information. This isn't a leak. This is purely me looking at the information we have available and making an educated guess, nothing more. To understand what led me to this thought, which might be totally wrong by the way, let's kind of understand some of the background of Threadripper and the high-end desktop line as it is today. A year and a half ago, the high-end desktop CPU was Intel's $1,700 i7 6950X that cost with 10 cores, and it was just, I mean, people were buying it because it was really exciting, because it was powerful, but it was really expensive and it wasn't that many cores. And Intel dominated the high end, so they just charged whatever the hell they wanted. AMD's CPU architecture uses something called Infinity Fabric. That means they can take CPUs and just plug them together on a single package, multiple CPUs, and they work as if it was a single CPU. It's great. Ryzen uses one of these CPU dies, like a desktop Ryzen, like 1800X or 2700X. There's one of those CPUs. EPYC, which is their server line, has up to 32 cores. That means they can have 4 CPUs working together. That exists, that is out, it's working, people have it. People have EPYC, 32 core CPUs. So from my understanding, what happened inside AMD, there was a group of engineers who had the idea of, hey, why don't we challenge AMD's high end? And they were given permission to just play with it. They basically just took an EPYC package, EPYC being their server line of CPUs with 4 dies on it, and they just deactivated 2 of the dies to make it work with the power delivery on a consumer motherboard easier. And they built a new chipset for it, and over the course of, what was it, like a number of weeks, maybe a couple months at most, they had a prototype for this working Threadripper system, they were calling it, with up to 16 cores, 32 threads. So they got it went into production. They didn't do a whole lot of R&D on it because they weren't really sure if it was going to be successful, and they didn't really need to do a lot just to get it out there and see if it would work. I think it was a bit of an experiment on their part, but it worked. Threadripper ended up being very successful. If you look at the numbers, Threadripper actually outsold the entire Skylake X line, which came a little bit after, admittedly. What Intel did there was they just responded to Threadripper by taking some they took some Xeons and went, i9, paste, there you go. Put those on a new chipset, send it off as a new enthusiast consumer brand. The problem with Intel, though, is they were extremely expensive. They had more cores, so yes, again, they do have the performance lead. The 7980XE is more powerful than Threadripper, not quite in every way, but very nearly. It's 18 cores, the cores run faster, the IPC is slightly better in most cases, it is a better CPU. Overall, by 10, 15, in some edge cases as much as 20% faster, but more usually around the 10% faster mark. For twice the price. Not really worth it to most people, so they're buying Threadripper. If you look at the sales, Threadripper actually sold more. So that brings us to our situation today. What's Intel doing about it? Well, they thought, so our mainstream line has up to 6 cores, but a lot of people aren't buying the high-end line because that's quite a bit more expensive, and they also still want to feel like they're focusing on gaming, not productivity and stuff like that. But people still want more cores. Ryzen proved that more cores is selling. The 2700X is selling very well right now. So what do? They decide that they're going to make an 8-core CPU and put it on mainstream. Not quite mainstream though, like an enthusiast mainstream below their extreme high-end desktop. I expect there to be an 8-core, maybe a 10-core, and probably supposedly more VRM and overclocking support and all of that stuff. Maybe some new features, but really for the most part, as far as we can tell, the chipset is basically identical to Z370. But the curious thing is, a little while after we started hearing about Z390, we started hearing about Z490 from AMD. And it just kind of sounds like they're just copying Intel, because they do that. They definitely copied Intel's naming scheme for their chipsets. That is totally a thing. AMD definitely copied that. But 490, what are they going to do with that? They have 490 and 499. Assumably 499 is coming. I'm making that assumption. Another curiosity is last generation we got an 1800X. There was 1700, 1700X, 1800X. This generation we got 2700 and 2700X. I do think we are getting a 2800X. And I think that 2800X is going to be the CPU that's on the Z490 chipset. I'm pretty sure of that. What the 2800X is going to be on that chipset is what I'm not sure about, but what I'm going to speculate on. You see, last generation Threadripper was a test. It was, let's try something and see if it sticks. There was very little effort put into it. They used a die that was way too big for what they had. They had this huge honkin' die, probably not actually that big, but it was this huge honkin' chip with 4 dies on it, half of them disabled. If you're actually intentionally designing a 16-core CPU with the Zen architecture, so you need 2 dies. So if they actually put some effort into it, they will design a chip with 2 dies on it, probably in a configuration like that. That would mean they could make it barely even larger than what AM4 is. I don't think it'll fit on AM4. I do think there's a good chance that they'll be able to get AM4 coolers to work with it. The smaller, simpler package with a smaller, simpler socket will mean lower prices. That was one of the big failings of Threadripper to begin with, is the sockets were massive and very expensive. TR4 motherboards were extremely expensive. You would spend half as much on the motherboard for a Threadripper system as you would on the CPU. It was pretty insane. But now they have the opportunity to design the entire thing knowing that it's going to be at least fairly successful, considering really they just have to take off the success from the previous generation and keep that up. But how do they keep that up? Take back the mantle. I think we're going to be seeing 2 more sockets from AMD this year. There's going to be the Z490 and the X499. I think we're also going to be introduced to a new product lineup. Threadripper will no longer be 8, 12, and 16 cores. I think they're going to introduce maybe 8, but the 1900X didn't really sell that well, so they might just drop it off. Something that I've noticed with the second generation Ryzen is there's a lot fewer products because they had a long lineup the first gen, but they noticed only a few were selling well. So they just took the few that were selling well and kind of integrated the rest of them and made a new lineup, which I think was an excellent decision. That was absolutely what I would have done. You don't want to confuse people. You want to make the decision simple. So having fewer is probably the better way to go. So given that, I expect to see 4 more CPUs from AMD this generation. I expect to see the 2800X, the 2850X, the 2900X, and the 2950XE. I also expect to see, like we saw with the 2700X, a decrease in per core price. We've already seen in this generation a $40 drop from the 1600X to the 2600X, from $250 to 210. With the 2700X compared to the 1700X, it's a $70 drop, often $80 depending on where you're looking. I expect that price reduction to extend all the way to the top end. So what I'm expecting to see for the 2800X is for it to actually be a 12-core CPU to compete directly with Intel's new 8-core and destroy it intentionally. Probably not on single-core performance, but I do expect it to be fairly decent in single-core performance, and I'll explain that a little bit later. The 2850X, I expect to replace the 1950X as the new 16-core CPU. The 1800X and the 1850X, I expect to both be called Ryzen 9. Again, borrowing from Intel, as AMD does. Moving on from there, I expect the 2900X to be a 24-core CPU on the X499 chipset, and the 2950XE I expect to be 32 cores. Now, I also expect the X499 motherboards to be more expensive than last year. The reason for that is they're going to need far more robust power delivery. The reason we couldn't have a 32-core Threadripper last year was power limitations. But now they've had time, they can build a platform around supporting up to 32 cores. Now, let's talk numbers. I expect AMD to launch the X490 aimed at gaming and productivity, with emphasis on the gaming as well as productivity, because these are going to be the highest clocked Zen CPUs we have ever seen. I feel it is very reasonable to assume that the 2800X, regardless if I'm right about everything else, is going to be able to hit 4.4 at least gigahertz on a single core. If not 4.4 across 4 cores like Threadripper did 4.2 across 4 cores. I expect the 2850X to hit at least 4.5 gigahertz. The reason I say this is the 2700X was able to hit 4.35 gigahertz on a single core boost. 4.5 gigahertz is only 150 megahertz faster than that. That's not really that big of a jump. And considering the gains that we saw in Threadripper, because of basically all of the Threadripper CPUs are seriously binned. They just picked the top, what was it, 5% CPUs and reserved those for Threadrippers. That allowed them to reach higher clock speeds than everything else on those CPUs, which I expect them to do exactly the same thing here. They're keeping the best Zen dies for Threadripper. Now, when we get to the 24-core 2900X and the 32 behemoth 2950XE, I expect these CPUs to start diminishing in clock speeds, aiming at an extreme performance on all cores. For the 2900X, I expect to see up to 4.2 gigahertz single core boost, and probably in the 3.2-ish gigahertz on all cores. And then for the 2950XE, probably 3 gigahertz on all cores and up to maybe just 4 gigahertz on a single core. But that means they will still be great for gaming if you want to use them for that, but they will be incredible for productivity. With 32 cores for a productivity workstation CPU or an enthusiast CPU, it will be bending the 7980XE over sideways for multi-threaded pure power. And as far as price goes, I've got a chart here. I expect to see the 2700X is $329. I expect the 2800 bucks to be about $500. That's the 12 cores for about $500. The 16 cores for probably 750 maybe. The 24 core CPU for probably 1,000. And then the 32 core CPU for about 1,500. And considering that a $1,500 CPU is $500 cheaper than Intel's current 18-core CPU with just over half the cores, it seems a little bit unrealistic until you realize that AMD currently has 32-core EPYC CPUs that cost $2,000. 32 cores already for the same price as Intel's 18. That's not even taking into account the fact that we see price decreases going from first gen to second gen already. The 1800X was $500. Really, the equivalent in the second gen is more powerful than the 1800X. The same number of cores is $170 cheaper. Not only are they extremely competitive with what Intel has, unlike what happened last year, Intel doesn't have an easy way to fully respond to this. They can't produce a CPU with more cores without notice. The way Intel responded to Threadripper last generation is they just took their Xeon server line and slapped i9 on it. I think I mentioned that earlier in the video. But they don't have a CPU that can one-up 32 cores. They have 28-core CPUs. That being said, I am fully willing to admit that their 28-core Xeon chips, that are $11,000 by the way, are pretty similar in performance to AMD's 32 cores. Even though their AMD has 4 extra cores, they don't have a definite performance lead. But they don't have to. AMD can produce these 32-core CPUs for far cheaper than AMD can produce their 28-core CPUs. As I mentioned, their 28-core CPUs are $11,000, not quite, but very close to $11,000. I want to say that there is no way that Intel is going to be able to release a 28-core desktop consumer CPU for less than $3,000. That means in the best case scenario, AMD is still at least roughly the same performance at half the price. And there is nothing that Intel can do to topple that. Anyway, thanks for watching my video. Sorry it's been a long time since I've made another one. I just got through a term of university and I've been working and excuses. If you guys like this video, I will be sure to make more. I've still got some other theories that I can talk about, but definitely let you know what I think of my theories. This is nothing, well, it's not even a theory, it's a hypothesis. It's something that I think could happen. Let me know if you think it's plausible. Let me know what you think Z490 is going to be for if you disagree with me. Let me know if you're excited to find out what it's going to be.